Welcome again to the Pastor and Postmaster podcast. What you wanted to hear in the sermon, but you didn't.
Where the Academy meets every day.
Hello.
Hello. Today we are talking about, we're extending a little bit of the topic we had from last time, which was about cults. Got quite a few of you get to take a look at that. Today we're going to make it a little bit more difficult because we're going to look at, we said this phrase, semi-cults. It's a harder one to classify, semi-cults. So a semi-cult. So we're thinking here, particular groups or ministries we'll also include here, but someone that didn't go into heresy technically, like they're not Jehovah's Witnesses, not Mormons. They fall somewhere in between, maybe both doctrine and practice. They're semi.
Right, and they'll have an orthodox view of, say, the Trinity, or very close, and who Jesus is.
High view of the Bible?
High view of the Bible, yeah. So they'll line up with evangelical doctrine pretty good, but then they'll have some unique distinctives that will sometimes alarm you.
Additions, subtractions, omissions,
Right.
Things like that.
Which
Yeah.
pushes you into the Galatians territory.
Yes. And because if you're an evangelical, you're probably exposed or you're familiar with some of these people either through YouTube things, literature, conferences.
Friendships.
Friendships.
Family,
Yes.
and business dealings, like in our area. You know, we're going to talk about Seventh-day Adventism.
Yeah, we're talking about Seventh-day Adventism. We're in Adventist country, you could say.
You bet.
Ellen G. White actually died in St. Helena. I was a pastor for 8 years in Sonoma, close by.
Right,
Wow.
and over in Angwin, that was always a Seventh-day Adventist community. The radio station over there.
And of course, we
transmitted
have
everywhere.
some up here in our neck of the woods.
Weimar.
Weimar,
Weimar
we
Institute.
live the Weimar Institute. We live here. We have some neighbors. I mean, so Adventism is quite an American original, you can say.
Sure.
Came out of that same magical year of 1844.
1844.
Tell us again what happened in
Don't let me-
1844.
don't
Not
let me get
1843.
started.
Not 1843, though. Not 1843.
In 1843. Go tell us.
1844
What happened in
was
1844?
the year when Joseph Smith was martyred.
That's not.
I'm telling you.
Significant year.
1844 was the year when the Bob made his declaration that he was the Cain, the promised one.
It's for the Baha'i faith, by the way, for those
Yeah.
of you who are unfamiliar with that. As he's
And-
speaking Arabic now.
Yeah. And 1844 was the year that
William Miller.
said that
He said that it would
The
be
return of Christ,
the
was
end
it?
of the world.
the return of Christ. And so
He did his math with the Book of Revelation,
It's
the
called
Book of
the
Daniel.
Great Disappointment, by the way.
yes,
The
because it
Great
didn't happen.
Disappointment.
Because people were standing on their roofs, literally in their ascension robes,
I didn't know that part.
waiting to go.
Wow.
And it didn't happen. So it was called the Great Disappointment.
You know what else is a disappointment is that Miller was a Baptist.
Oh.
Ooh, we have to be honest about that. We can't hide that. He
Yeah.
was a Baptist.
Yeah.
And he was a kind of a self-taught farmer who read his Bible. And honestly, I mean, an obviously very intelligent man, even to do the chronologies.
Sure.
I mean, if you read the Book of Daniel without notes, it's mystifying a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, these people are generally pretty sharp.
Yes.
And like when people from on the Mormon side, the same era, the same soil, Joseph Smith, he was a fool. Crackpot.
Yep.
No, he's a highly intelligent man.
Yeah.
I say he was like a backwoods genius, and he was
Yeah.
a very good communicator, and he could come up with narratives, stories just on the fly.
Yeah.
What a year of religious chaos. Like, what a year of
And we
shaking
just touched
faith.
on a few things.
And
There was a
that's
lot
very
going on.
pertinent to like our day.
Sure.
There are millions of adherents from the groups that splintered out of that. You know, revival, the Second Great Awakening, I mean, has a huge impact on our country. And, like all revivals, you do notice that there are very strong counterfeits that come out of it. Jesus Revolution, like we talked about.
Sure.
Children of God,
Well-
Way International.
Well, we were talking yesterday. So I'm wandering around in Whittier, California in 1972, 73. That's the Jesus Revolution. And I run into the Way International.
Yep.
I'm cleaning a restaurant exhaust ducts, and I meet this guy, and he's part of my crew, and he's a member of the Way. What's that? Where will? And he goes,
Yep.
hey, you want to go to a Twig meeting,
Twig
which is their Bible study. So Denise and I, my wife, we go to this Twig meeting, and it was held in an apartment upstairs above the magic shop in Whittier, California.
Be a
the
great,
place where
great
we would go
story.
to buy,
Ominous.
oh yeah, where we would go buy whoopee cushions, and the fake gum that makes your mouth all blue and and all that kind of stuff, as well as card tricks and things like that. But anyway, so we went, and that was a real experience watching them do their Way thing,
Tongue speaking.
prophesying, and interpreting around a circle in a very orderly way.
Yep.
That stood out to me. And the most interesting part of that is about 7 years later, as Denise and I are coming out of Mormonism, my best friend gets saved, goes to Biola. He starts going to Calvary Chapel in Whittier, California, and he meets this guy, Lonnie. And so we become fast friends, and we're hanging out all the time. Hey, we're going to go over to Lonnie's house, the apartment above the magic shop.
Same place.
So it was redeemed.
Where it was
There's
redeemed.
a lot of Lonnies back then.
This is a very popular.
My
Lonnie
dad's
Frisbee?
testimony,
Lonnie
there was
Frisbee.
Lonnie.
Well, my
his
wife.
band.
Well, it's a thing. My wife's name is Denise, and her sister was Diane. There's millions of them.
There are a lot of
Jeez.
Dianes.
In 1955.
Bring
Yeah.
Lonnie, bring Lonnie back.
Bring Lonnie back. Who's your next son gonna be named?
Have your
Lonnie?
baby. You're like Lonnie.
Lonnie.
So there you go. There's these groups, and
Yeah.
I was running into those people all the time because I was hitchhiking.
And the Way International is a little easier to classify as a cult because it was anti-Trinitarian.
Yes.
And Gnostic.
Yes. And when Wherewell went away, like they kind of vanished. I'm sure somebody will say, no, they're, I think
here.
they're still around, but he was such a strong personality riding around on his Harley.
Yep.
He was this.
Oh, he rode in a Harley. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was his thing. He
Wow.
was
But he would kind of came out of nowhere. I remember reading about his biography, and he came out of the Midwest. These guys almost appeared in the most unexpected places. Just mid-America, folksy guys.
so like one of the guys that we're going to talk about today,
Yeah.
Bill Gothard.
Bill Gothard, same thing.
Just-
Illinois. I mean, you just expect kind of just
right out of the heartland.
right out of the heartland. Let's talk about the Adventists a little bit. Again, they're
Okay.
they're a little difficult to classify. In the very title, Adventist coming.
1844.
Yeah, explain that a little bit to us.
The coming of Christ, and so they're looking forward. They're chiliastic. They're
Yep.
They're
Like a
they're looking
millennial.
for they're looking for Jesus to return. And in the case of Miller, he date set it. He set a date.
Yep, and they had a couple, just like the Jehovah's Witnesses, as you said, they're very closely aligned. There were several false fulfillments, and but we were talking about this just privately, just how that distinctive is so important. Even I remember hearing this where the churches are planted, they don't do it in urban areas. Tell me if you've ever been to an urban area like San Francisco, been in Denver, and seen an Adventist church plant. I don't know if I have.
Yeah, I can't say. Although there's some urbanites who were famous Adventists. Prince,
Oh, he was.
right? He grew up in an Adventist home,
And Michael Jackson was raised Jehovah's Witness.
right? Dr.
Wow.
Dr. Ben Carson, Adventist.
Yes, Ben Carson's Adventist. That's correct.
Right.
That's true.
Did not know that.
Yes, and the Sabbatarianism, the second like core dimension to them is Sabbatarianism.
Yes.
They are restorationists. They're seeing themselves as the true church, and one of the things they do is they read the Old Testament. I don't know what particular way they read it, but they would say the Sabbath needs to be restored as a part of kind of purification of the people of God.
Yeah, they hold that the Sabbath, keeping the Sabbath, is the seal of a Christian, whereas we would say that the Holy Spirit is the seal of the Christian.
And the fruit that comes with that.
Yeah,
The Sabbatarianism, it's very easy if you historically follow it. You realize, I've been obviously teaching church history now. So, Christians celebrated very early on. I mean, in the book of Acts, in the earliest patristic attestations, they celebrate the resurrection of Christ. It's the 8th day, which is the day of new creation. And so when you see that, you see finally with Constantine, then there is a formal recognition of the Sabbath, but of Sunday as the Lord's day. But people were celebrating worship on Sunday.
Yeah, and it's not by a positive command of Christ or something.
Nope.
It just happens. And I have my own particular theory about that, which I would love to go into sometime about how that came about. But every time Jesus shows up after he rises from the dead, it's on the first day of the week, and
You're right.
And every time he shows up, they eat. So I would see that as
Pretty significant.
why Christians are
Yep.
meeting on the first day of the week and they're celebrating the Lord's Supper. In other words, every time you get together on the Lord's Day, you break bread, Jesus shows up. He was recognized in the breaking of the bread.
Good. Yep.
So
I love that. I love that line.
And I'm not saying that I'm saying that in not a mystical way, but it just explains. It could be an explanation. So.
And with the Adventists in particular, I mean, they're holding to the Sabbath, reappropriating it, whatever they're trying to do, restore it. It hints at a deeper hermeneutical problem and a problem of interpretation about looking at the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. It's a fundamental question of how to interpret the relationship of the New Testament to the Old Testament, New Covenant, Old Covenant.
Which is a difficult task for all of us.
Difficult task.
Okay.
Yes.
And so for when I was dealing with Adventists a lot, which I hardly ever talk to many Adventists anymore, but there was a time when I was interacting with Adventists quite a bit. And what I learned, and this will point up a problem among evangelical Christians. I found that once you agree that once you say that Sunday is the Sabbath, you've kind of fallen into
the trap.
An issue that they've got you and you're never going to get out of.
Yep.
Because so I began
It's not the Sabbath.
telling myself Saturday's the Sabbath, Sunday's the Lord's Day.
Yep.
And so then you can deal with ceremonial versus moral law and those kind of things in a way that, say, Calvin would, or anybody since the Reformation.
Yep. Without Puritanism, you would not have Adventism, because remember how they held a tight, almost indistinguishable connection between the fourth commandment and worship.
Yes.
Think about them as a tight-knit community. The early church, you didn't have that, much less the civil cohesion. Mm-hmm. So you think about that. And by the way, this is a great question. Are the 10 Commandments binding for all Christians? Anyone who's actually honest and consistent would say no, not in the same way. They're not binding as law covenant. This is a kind of a little bit of a deeper discussion. But basically, most of us would basically say yes, that those things that reflect God's character, that we carve out the Sabbath. Or if we make the fatal mistake of saying, well, Sunday is the Sabbath, then we're now back into, okay, what's the Old Testament Sabbath expectation? But the Adventists don't keep it that way either, do they?
No.
They don't?
No.
No one does.
No. And in fact, if you go into the Old Testament and Sabbath, you realize that the seventh-day Sabbath rolls into other Sabbaths, which roll into Jubilees.
Yep.
And so you have this
50th year.
Yeah, you have this whole calendar. And so for an Adventist to say that they keep the Sabbath is not true.
Not true.
Mm-hmm.
Because you cannot keep the Sabbath outside of the geographical boundaries of Israel with a temple or tabernacle at the center and an entire calendar.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work.
Yep.
So, and there's ways to deal with that because we have Sabbatarian Christians, evangelicals, and there's ways to deal with that. But the Adventists did help me to come to my view on the role of the law in the Christian's life. Do you split ceremonial and moral? Do you divide those two? And I was kind of concerned about my view on that. And so I started asking around and I said, are there people that hold this view? And I would lay it out, and we can talk about that another time. It's
Deep.
It's too involved.
Too involved.
And they would say, well, you're what they would call a new covenant. You're
That's what I
into new
am.
covenant theology. And I thought, well, that must be fairly new because it's not on my bookshelf.
Yep.
So is that a development that's come around?
Yeah,
the last
the New
30 or
Covenant
40
theology
years?
is a distinctively Baptist contribution.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because
I never said that I'm a Baptist. That's never been my.
yeah, it's so Old Covenant theology. So people who are like, I'm Reformed, I'm Reformed.
Sure.
Whatever that means. I don't know what that means sometimes. I seriously
Anymore.
don't mean, yeah.
Yeah.
It means all sorts of things.
Sure.
Maybe it means you have a podcast.
Maybe
I don't have a beard.
Maybe you have
though.
a beard and a
I
cigar.
don't have a beard. So that kind kind of undermines my
He's
credibility.
growing one. He'll grow one. We'll get him
My
some
wife won't let
handlebars.
me. A mustache with wax on it.
Yeah.
I'll get a fake one. So
And a beer.
And a beer.
And a beer.
Or
And a beer.
whiskey.
Yeah.
BER.
Yep. Adventists would very much be strongly against the beer.
Yes.
That's something else that comes out of that time period is the prohibition
Well,
going into many denominations.
yeah, and it was culture wide. It was kind of like a health kick.
It was a health. Remember Jonathan Fisher?
Yeah,
He
sure.
took one for the team.
Well,
He
that
did-
was an Ellen White obsession too, right?
Well,
All of them.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Mormons, Methodists, Baptists.
Well,
I
it was in the culture. It was even not just among religious groups. It was the graham cracker.
It was kind of like I don't know. It'd be like saying something like, "We're not gonna eat fast food. We know how damaging
Right.
it is. I mean, and we're just gonna in some ways
we're gonna eat
protest.
grains.
We're gonna eat grains.
Yeah.
Well, and I appreciate that about my Adventist friends that they take great care of things. Like we can always learn from other people. And one
Sure.
thing I learned from the Adventists is their love for Jesus is very real. Like we can see that. But they're just so bound by law that it's kind of hard. But it's just like I would look at a Calvinist because I don't profess to be a Calvinist, but I learn a lot of their love for the scriptures and how to divide and read it and understand it. And so we can all learn from one another, cult or not, I suppose.
Maybe we should have to do a little bit riff on Matt Walsh's movie. Am I a Calvinist?
Oh my.
Am I a Calvinist? I think it'd be funny because
Right.
a lot of people mean a lot of things by that.
That's right.
And how far are the boundaries? But going back though to the civil ceremonial. So in classic covenant theology, you do have and this is going back to the medieval church.
Sure.
Civil ceremonial moral laws.
Well,
A
yeah. and
distinction.
of all the views, I mean, back when I was really trying to sort this out. I mean, the Adventists didn't push me into it, but I was always encountering them. And then as a Christian, you're going through this. What's the relationship between the old and the new covenant, and the different covenants? And so when I really went through it, I found that of all the views that divided the law, moral, ceremonial, civil,
Yep.
or whatever, some don't recognize
They
that.
don't fit easily.
Right. I found that of all the views that I didn't agree with, Calvin was the best.
Yeah.
I thought Calvin did the best job,
Yeah.
even though I didn't hold his view.
And he basically held, and this is the connection with Adventism too, is he held a typological connection between the Sabbath and the Lord's Day, and
Right.
this is what Adventists in the medieval church too, because if I remember right, even till relatively recently, if you're Roman Catholic and you don't go to Mass on Sunday, then you are guilty of breaking the fourth commandment.
Yes.
So there's a long history of moving that, but that's not held the same way either. So it's not consistent.
But when
You
you're
should worship,
talking
by
about
the way.
Seventh-day Adventism, that's like one of the most obvious features of their
Theology.
denomination, I guess you would call them, since we're saying that they're really a distinct stream as opposed to a denomination, but we'll use the term denomination.
They don't see themselves as part of the church history.
But the dietary part, how their relationship to the law, those are the things that we notice most readily. But the big issues with the Adventists really are Ellen G. White and the investigative judgment.
Yep.
Tell us about that.
So if you go back to, like I said last time, if you went back to 1900, you would find Adventism and the Jehovah's Witnesses, Dawn Bible students and groups,
They're the same.
those kind of, they'd be very similar because they would have some sort of form of annihilationism, soul sleep, millenarianism,
Yep.
they're
Anti-Trinitarian.
Yeah,
anti-Trinitarian.
because weren't they Unitarian before?
Yeah.
They wouldn't call themselves
They
that.
wouldn't, but now they are Trinitarian.
They're Arian.
Yeah, well, with the Adventists, yeah. Anyway, they wouldn't hold to the deity of Christ, the pre-existent, the Son, as deity. But then you move forward, and in 1950, I think it is, Donald Gray Barnhouse wrote an article about the Adventists where he was really hard on them, and the Adventists pushed
Famous
back.
Presbyterian.
Were really upset, and I think Eternity was the evangelical magazine at the time.
Yeah.
And so they pushed back hard and got into a dialogue with him. And so Barnhouse asked Walter Martin, a young Walter Martin, hey, will you look into this for me? And that began a dialogue with evangelical leaders and apologists and the theologians, because by that time the Adventists had colleges, Bible colleges, with like recognized theologians who had done the work,
But by the way, just a note here, if you go to the Evangelical Theological Society meeting, which is kind of like the standard conference for most evangelicals, Adventists are there.
Yep.
Because all you have to do is you have to sign that you agree to two things, the Trinity, kind of a classic, basic Trinitarian definition, and inerrancy of the Scriptures. But they would not have gone before 19...
Right, they would have been excluded.
They wouldn't want to be a part of that.
Yeah.
That's wild.
So this dialogue began around 1950, I think it was. And what it does is it results into this publication by the Adventists, Questions on Doctrine, where they say explicitly and in pretty good detail what we believe. And at that point, Barnhouse and Walter Martin and a number of evangelicals said, okay, we're going to view them as a denomination. And so we're going to see them as a denomination. Now, some people push back, like Anthony Hoekema.
Oh, okay.
And some other people, they said no, because some of their other doctrines are out there enough, or
that they're not.
Or their soteriology is off enough where they're not. But so that's why we're addressing them under the
semi-cult.
A semi-cult, and why we have, we live amongst a lot of Adventists, we have a lot of interaction. So we would probably say ourselves like Barnhouse or Martin would, like, they've got some oddball ideas.
They're sectarian of some kind.
Yeah, and like I said last time, I like to be, like, I would accept them as a brother and sister, knowing full well that they really don't accept me because I worship on Sunday. So,
well, that they would say that you would be we are in the tribulation, I think, towards the end, right? And I mean,
well, they would say
so you would be killing them, right, or going after them.
Well, that's
soon.
later. There's going to be a time when the Protestants and the U.S. government, and I think I'm pretty sure it's the U.S. government, will pass laws against Sunday Sabbath keeping, and they'll hunt Adventists down.
Yep.
And I've seen Adventists talk about how at Adventist schools they used to have these drills as children.
Oh, no way.
What would you do? Yeah, when the Sabbath laws are enacted,
the agents come in.
So, but the point being is, I have a more generous view towards them than they have of me, so I don't feel bad about calling them a semi-cult. It's
it's interesting, Bo. I was just thinking about, we were talking about this. Just if the distinctives that make us, say, Baptist, and if you don't use the label, just broadly evangelical. If the distinctives that we have were taken away, we would still fit within the church.
Absolutely.
Like if we were like wrong, that we should be baptizing infants and we should be having bishops.
Yeah, we would still be within the historic Orthodox stream.
But what if, and maybe we'll take a moment to clarify this. What if their distinctives were taken away?
Well, and that's the interesting thing that came out of all this. And then later, around 1980, and you Adventists can correct me on this, where they had the big conference at Glacier View Ranch in Colorado. That's where Desmond Ford was kind of like fired from the church. He was no longer considered.
He was taken out.
A professor. They revoked his ordination because he went after the investigative judgment, and they decided there that they could not dispense with the investigative judgment. I mean, they'd said that many years before.
Maybe
So the two distinctives that Adventists cannot give up is the inspiration and the role of Ellen G. White and the investigative judgment. And
we'll stop here.
if they did, they could do that and go the way of the Worldwide Church of God. But then they would just be another denomination among many. And I just don't think that works from their perspective.
Yeah.
So the investigative judgment, after the Great Disappointment, Ellen G. White embraced this view put forward by somebody else about the investigative judgment, that Christ was not actually going into the Holy of Holies. Coming out of the Holy of Holies to redeem us. He was going into the Holy of Holies to engage in the investigative judgment, and that is to pore over the names of the people who are written in the book of life and go over their obedience or lack of obedience.
It works.
Yeah, so it becomes a works-based thing, and so the most practical application of that is for the Adventists is that you're not saved. That's a future event, whereas all the declarations of Paul in the Gospels and so forth, that you are saved.
Yep.
You're being saved.
Yep. Have been saved.
Yeah, have been saved. That comes in conflict.
Yep.
And then so you have the investigative judgment, which they did not repudiate or cast aside in the 50s or again in the 80s when it was challenged. And there's something interesting to say about that. I've run into a number of former Adventists who were high-ranking either pastors or professors or whatever, and they would tell you that in discussions with well-known Adventists or people, professors or whatever, they would say, well, we know that we have real problems with Ellen G. White. She was a plagiarist. Many of her doctrines are false. We shouldn't look to her for doctrine. And they would say, we know that the investigative judgment just isn't true. But they would say, but we don't feel like we should chuck the whole thing. And so...
Sacred tradition.
Yeah. And then in public, they would make pronouncements, favorable. They would continue to uphold Ellen G. White in the investigative judgment. So that was a cause of a number of Adventists to lose faith and leave Adventism.
That's unfortunate.
So when you think of those two distinctives, and there's a few others, to my mind, there's a real problem there. They can't really give those distinctives up because they wouldn't be Seventh-day Adventists anymore.
Yeah.
And in saying that, I don't mean they can't do it. They could do that, and they would be another evangelical, Arminian sort of a denomination. But they're unwilling to do that.
Yep. Since they have a pretty young history, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the near future. But that kind of gives us a nice transition to talk about something very similar to Adventism, but not in the sense of a church body or denomination, but it's actually Bill Gothard.
Bill Gothard.
So would you say it's Bill Gothard, it's not a denomination, is it a movement or is it a
teaching?
A teaching?
Yeah. So since it was so much connected with a singular figure, and he's a larger than life figure, a man of surprising influence, seemingly comes out of nowhere. Yes, all his influence has kind of waned with him. So it might be a little bit like the Way International, but not in the sense that it was heretical technically,
right.
But it was connected with this particular person. That's part of what made it semi-cultish as a parachurch.
Yeah, so they would have seen themselves as a parachurch, right? He would have seen
Parachurch program.
Okay.
So Bill Gothard, I mean, you can look this up. You can watch Shiny Happy People. I'm not deconstructing, so I'm not totally on board with that kind of I don't know what you want to call it, genre of anti-evangelical stuff. But But Gothard, his influence is astounding. He started a ministry in the late 1960s. It was like it went basic youth conflicts. I wasn't raised in it, just remotely familiar. But when I was early in seminary, some friends that were involved in it, and then later my wife, of course, when I met her, she had been raised in it. We were joking today. I said, "What were you? Were you a level 1, level 2, or level 3?" She's like, "I was a level 2." Like the level 1 is like, hey, maybe you went to one of the main seminars he would host regionally all over the country. Level 2, you went to more than one, and you were really deeply into the book. She memorized all the songs. You knew the doctrines. Level 3 is like you're an intern there.
You're looking at the book for what outfit you're wearing.
Yeah. You look at there's a
guideline.
So my friend gave me one of the reasons about it was before the internet, all of the material you have to go to the conferences to get the books. These red books.
Right. The binders.
And my friend,
to this day, still the binders?
I don't know if the conferences still exist. I don't know.
Okay.
Ooh.
Because the board kind of ghosted him. He's very old now.
Is this the IBLP?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, just as an aside, so you two were not alive in 1975, I take it.
No.
I was born in 85.
So in 1975, Denise and I were Mormons. We had been to the Way International Twig meeting. I'd run into Hare Krishnas. I'd run into every kind of faith, religion, running around Southern California. And I went to work with a guy who was a school teacher. So I was a paid aide at a school district. And he told me that if I really wanted to unlock my truth, that I should go to Institutes and Basic Youth Conflicts.
Yep.
So I remember that. Even though I didn't go to it, and even though I never paid attention to it after that, I remember he was very insistent that it would be the key to unlock my happiness. And he was a Baptist, he was a Christian, and he even offered to pay to go to the conference for me.
You can see the videos of him like at the conferences. I mean, entire stadiums filled. He walks out.
Yes,
I almost expect him to do the Hitler or Goebbels or the Hermann Göring. They'll put the hand up, like the hand motion here as they cheer. It's like a Nuremberg rally.
There's something that's why I'm careful to say, like if I'm involved in, which I am involved in parachurch organizations, one being a 3-day lay renewal weekend that I sometimes do, and I'm always careful with vernacular because they're like, oh, it'll change your life. It'll, la la la. And I'm like,
well, Jesus changed my life. So.
Thank you. That's the ticket right there. That's why we're so.
Well, two things on that. So I just read a really good article on something, and I was cheered. I felt so good because the person writing the article said he was talking about a conference that he's a part of. Putting on, and he says we are not parachurch. That
alongside the
that
church
term
is what that
always
means.
Bothered me because it's like alongside, like, well, the church is kind of listing to this side, so it needs somebody. He said we're not parachurch, we're sub church, and so
you're sub church.
Yeah, so we're
under.
Yes. Under the church. We're under the church. And I think that's an important distinction.
Is it like an umbrella? Is it like I'm just kidding.
Yeah, you're right. Under the umbrella. Well, that's
that
the
means
thing.
You don't as a conference or a help or some sort of group, you don't, the church technically doesn't need you.
Oh.
Yep. But in Gothard's system,
the church may welcome you, or the church may say, hey, this is helpful. But the church doesn't need anything.
Yeah. In Gothard's system, he would have, for instance, pastor's conference, but he's not a pastor. And as far as I know, never part of a church. But he would do these. I just talked to the pastor.
See, that's alarm bells right there.
Alarm bells. Bo and Kyla, it's remarkable. And Janae, I've been reading this book right here. So this has kind of been a source, Matter of Basic Principles by Don Vano. Is it Vano? Is that how they say it? Vanot?
I'm not sure.
Ron Hensel. It talks. This book came out. This is crazy. This book came out in 2003. this is like the time that Janae is in this, and it's investigative. It's an investigative judgment in this one. It's investigative and it's a judgment. They interacted with them.
We'll cut that out of there.
No, we'll leave it.
Oh, that's
Leave that
great.
one.
We'll leave it. So they did all sorts of research. They met with Bill Gothard, so this is hard evidence. But I mean, the stuff, the authoritarianism of his system it's credible. He singularly had so much control over a system. It is a system of principles that it essentially tells you how to live every part of your life. These authors called it a Talmud for Christians.
Wow.
An extra biblical set of commentaries to help keep you within line. And so, the big theme is that umbrella of protection. Even if you've never been immersed in it, you're not level 2 or 3, you probably are familiar with that. So in Gothard's system, you have God, him, dad. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
So one of the things about it that's the most devastating, and at the end we'll talk a little bit about like pastorally why it's devastating, is that there's this idea that there's this hierarchy and this ascending level of authority, which there's biblical things of authority, but there's never a sense that, like, say, parents can never err, or that, of course, Bill can never err.
Wow.
And so that creates, it is, and this is the thing people don't know. They'd be surprised by this. It is a form of prosperity theology, not a wealth
A
and
plus
health.
B will equal
If-
C.
Yeah, if then.
If then.
Yep. A formula for perfect children.
So when you were
Exactly. That's what people like it.
describing that, to my mind, this cheesy 70s graphic came up in my mind of little umbrellas.
Yep.
I'm going
is
to put that on
The
our
leaky umbrella.
video.
Yes.
Is that for real?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, is it still used?
we have
The
some of the books. I
umbrella.
could bring them on there.
I'm going to put an umbrella in
So
here.
the umbrella thing, and Gothard always had, principles is an ambiguous word. I mean, as you know, in Colossians and Galatians, principles can be demonic beings. That translation, legalism, they're kind of the similar things.
Right.
The stoicheia.
Yes. So the story. Would that be an example of semantic domain where
Semantic
you have a word
domain.
that
Wide.
that can mean beings,
Yep.
or it can mean principles, like the way we think of principles?
Yeah, exactly. Principalities. I mean,
Yes.
powers, thrones. Those things are both symbols, and then they also have like a metaphysical dimension to it. But yeah, the basic principles. I mean, there's an irony there that it says most English translations in Colossians 2 say don't submit to the basic principles. Don't touch, don't eat. Gothard basically fills in. It's almost Islamic, where it gives you answers for all the things that the Bible doesn't. And people love that. He tells you what to eat. He has a whole section, I could bring it on here, of how the kind of faces women are supposed to make.
Right.
Like literally with like
The wink.
The voices.
the voices, the clothes, the kind of food you should eat. He tells you things like you got to make covenants not to get married. You should never get married under age 30.
How to punish your children.
How to punish your children.
Okay, so we're talking about this as a semi-cult.
Yeah,
Right.
it is. If you're
But-
deep in it.
Okay, because you have an authoritative figure,
Yep.
and
Yeah,
you have
that's
extra
true.
biblical
Yep.
guidance. Let's be charitable. I mean,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
it's
yeah.
guidance, right?
It's guidance.
So, but just you telling me that last observation, filling in all the places where the Bible doesn't speak.
Yep.
See, of course, that harkens to me back to bona fide actual cults, where they will find areas that the Bible doesn't speak to and erect really. They'll say, we know what that means.
That's
you
this
don't know what that
knowledge,
means,
right.
but we do.
Secret knowledge.
Yeah, the secret knowledge, and that's what sets them apart from others.
Yeah.
So it's kind of divisive. It kind of fences you out.
It's so divisive and it's so far reaching because it was under this, like, he almost owned every, because back then you didn't have a way and means to check it as easily. You had to know the word really well, but you couldn't just go and listen.
You couldn't live stream it. You couldn't put it
You
on
had
YouTube.
Walter Martin maybe, but
Yeah,
he didn't
well,
even really go into that.
No, and I heard, I was kind of like going back and refreshing on this, just for like, I just put about an hour in, and to your point, one guy was talking, and he was talking about it back in the day when I first heard about it, when you would go to these huge conferences, and he said that in between sessions they would hand you the binder for the next session. So it's not like you got the binder 2 weeks in
Pre-read it.
advance.
Yeah.
Nope.
And he said, so, and nothing that he said, there were a lot of anecdotes and stories. And so he could redefine words or whatever. It would be impressed upon you. And you weren't really, you didn't have your guard up.
And thus why Ryan said prosperity theology.
Yep.
Because
If you do this, you will prosper.
Then but don't study what we
Well,
have to say.
and the big thing is the courtship thing, and I mean that's a whole nother discussion about the whole courtship thing. Obviously, an idea of courtship biblically, you have a surprisingly scarce amount of information about how to meet a spouse in the Bible, especially the Old Testament.
Well, yeah, and that again, I hate to go all weird on everyone, but if you think about it, the Bible assumes a community.
It does.
Where you know people.
Yep.
It assumes that when you're appointing elders,
They're older.
that you know them.
You know
when
them.
you're appointing deacons, it assumes that you know them in their daily life. And it assumes that you're interacting. So you really wouldn't have to have a lot of courtship.
Yeah, most cultures have that ingrained already.
Yeah, it's already in you.
Yeah. He has a view of your courtship, and I experienced this to some level too. An odd set of principles about that, but it basically involves kind of the system where you can't really ever get to know someone if you hold to the principles correctly to ever meet someone. You can't go on dating. And I understand this. No, you can't date. You have to ask the father's permission, and then it's like he has to be a mediator between you, and so you're never alone. It's almost like an arranged marriage, but not quite. So it can really mess people up if they're getting strung along for a long time. Plus, Gothard adds a bunch of strange things, like you have to be able to pay for an entire house in cash before you can never get a loan. So you have to be kind of wealthy. You have to be able to basically kind of appease the dad, and then you're never supposed to ever have time alone. So you're not supposed to really talk. You can't write letters. It's so strange.
So
weird.
Yeah, that's interesting. So like the prosperity gospel, it doesn't really work in Africa. So like when we went to Africa, I went to a pastor's conference in Africa. I mean, you're bringing up stuff that, after being introduced to Bill Gothard through my friends saying, this will change your life.
Oh, it'll change your life already.
I just knew people who were going. I was never interested. So it's like I knew nothing about it. So this is kind of like first time for me. So we go to a pastor's conference and we find out that 20 of the pastors there have not been married. They're there with their
long time.
Gothard was never married.
Common law.
And so, the Western pastors are freaking out. And it's explained to us the dowry. These men,
Yes.
they couldn't afford. So I mean, it was the same kind of thing. They couldn't afford to get married because they couldn't pay the bride price.
So a cultural practice hindered
Marriage.
In this book, they mentioned
That's extra biblical.
Yeah, all cultures have that.
Sure.
And in Gothard's too, the authors here point out how Boaz, Joseph, these people wouldn't fit Gothard's standards of marriage, and then he himself, of course, is not married. But I would say this too, I would say this is one of the most terrible outcomes of this whole system. Apart from the fact that parents, I try to apologize to my kids as young as they are when I sin or I'm angry. But in this system, there's this idea that if you obey your parents without question, you will be blessed. So when you get married, we know people never not even held hands. I mean, much less went on a date or kissed. Then you're going to have the most amazing marriage. And if you had any kind of sin before marriage, you're going to be cursed forever. That's why he's against adoption. Don't adopt kids because they're bad seeds.
I'm learning so much that I didn't know.
Yeah, and so
I'm alarmed.
Yeah.
You know how many people though? Bo, you know how many people though
pervasive.
that get married that then have all the same horrible problems everybody's marriages. Pornography.
It's a breeding ground for sexual sin, which you see happening even recent in this group of this kind of subcult, partial cult group. It's so far reaching. It gets into, I mean, there's like you said, Baptists even who have, kind of delved in or used some of this curriculum, and we see the damage it's done to families.
So the curriculum, you brought up the curriculum. So in me just trying to get up to speed, I learned that that they shifted, that Gothard shifted in the 80s from the conferences because they were dwindling into homeschool materials.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes,
Oh,
that's
okay.
correct.
See, I'm learning along with you.
Look it up.
Finally, it's not
I'm-
me.
I'm a postmaster. I'm
You know, they would hate me,
What a humble
by the
man
way.
you are.
They would hate this.
They would hate this podcast.
podcast because I'm a female.
well, I'm glad because I'm learning things, and I'm sure it'll give me insight into things that I'm encountering that I just didn't know.
You know, one thing, but I would say there's some critical things, and Janae and I have talked about this forever. You know, we joke that this is like our nighttime reading literature together.
It literally is their nighttime
because
reading.
it literally is, and we talk about it because we are weird. And she knows all the songs. She'll tell me what the songs are. And but she would say how we were reading this carefully, and what people missed, and I think this is apart from the fact that he plays fast and loose with the exegesis and he commits eisegesis and everything else and crazy things like that he makes up and people just accept it as gospel. But he has a definition of grace. This probably might be the central part of his. He defines grace. He says it's an active, dynamic energy from God to carry out his will, which is not a definition of grace by most standard. It's unmerited favor. It is mercy received. He considers active principle. It's somewhat of almost a Roman Catholic definition of grace.
Interesting.
Well, isn't our understanding of grace, and if I get this wrong, see,
We're not cutting it.
I'm the postmaster, so we can edit this or not. Yeah. I don't mind being wrong, or, I'm here to learn from you. I'm sitting at your feet.
I'm learning from you,
Rabbi.
You're the Adventist.
Rabbi Brian.
Let me pull my Talmud out.
So, Dr. Rendels, isn't our understanding of grace, isn't it anchored in God's faithfulness, his hesed?
Yeah.
Like,
it's God's faithfulness.
His loving
covenant
towards us.
As Calvin kind of the translations say, propitious towards us, favorable towards us. I mean,
yes.
It's always the initiative of God to give us good things, both mercy and then positively, of course, in salvation, his righteousness.
Yes.
But you would not say, you would say something like, the process of sanctification would be one by which the Holy Spirit allows us to work and to achieve God's will. But that's after God's righteousness is imputed to us.
Yes.
So he has a faulty definition of grace. The faulty definition of grace spills into everything. Like, why, for instance, would you, with all the metaphors of adoption in the New Testament, why would you say something like that? That Christians should reject adoption, unless you had a view of grace like this.
Why do a lot of their people have a lot of adopted kids though? There's a lot of adopted.
It's a great question. I think I don't know many that have.
Okay.
To be honest, maybe they broke with him on that point.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to find out.
How dare they? But
let me ask this. I mean, since I think since you brought that up, like, why do so many adopt and break with this? So is there any does he hold anything over people where they would fear getting out of his favor, or they would be concerned? I mean, since it's not a church per se.
Yes, and that is one reason why it's not the same as the Way International or Scientology or even Adventism, because most people are in the sphere of his magnetic pull. And like they'll often, you'll hear people say things and they won't know it's Gothard that brought it, but it's his teaching that comes through, that umbrella protection. But yes, most people I'd say would be like in the level 1 or part of level 2. They're not the full bought in where they went to the commune and they worked as interns. Like there's an example that the authors here give where this girl is 13 years old and she went to one of the conferences, and then Gothard personally said, I think she's a rebellious child, and told the family she needs to stay at the compound with me.
What?
For like months. And she was like in there for a year, put in solitary confinement.
Okay.
and then whipped, disciplined in front of Gothard and the family.
Wow.
Most people wouldn't believe me if I told you that.
Okay, so as someone who's learning about this movement or this teaching that I escaped,
Yes.
not by being discerning or anything, I just wasn't interested.
Yeah.
So is there any form of exclusion that he would practice through, what's it called? I just
Shunning?
knew it as Institutes and Basic
Yeah.
Yeah.
Life
principles.
principles. Yeah.
Youth
It's the
Conflicts.
Institute
is what I
of
heard.
Basic Legalistic Principles.
Okay, so is there any
That's what they call it.
is there any
Leverage?
explicitly enforced exclusion, or is there implied exclusion if you get out of line, or is it, hey, you can take these teachings or leave them to the Christian?
As I know,
do you see what I'm saying?
yeah, I know it. Once you're in the inner circle, I mean, I
Sure.
hear that it's pretty standard. I mean, and a lot of people obviously like with the Duggars, famously, the whole show, they were adherents to his doctrines. There's a lot of prestige that comes with that. So like as you get within that circle, you would lose the favor that he gives. His name. But I don't know if you mean enforcement. That's the part that's a little bit difficult because I don't think there is quite the same.
Yeah.
Most people wouldn't be in the situation where Gothard personally said you need to be in solitary confinement.
Yeah, I would see
haven't
where
heard too much of
the from what I've heard, so the exclusion would come among your family members.
Yes.
That's where you would be.
in the
held in
80s
heart.
and 90s. It definitely divided churches where it was like people are like,
Okay.
we don't go to, oftentimes it was with youth groups or with music that had certain beats, which would be most contemporary worship music, Jesus movement music would be, that's a big thing that I heard first. It's like, oh yeah, drums are bad. But he also has some odd beliefs, for example, about there's a lot of anecdotal and superstitious stories, like story of a woman who was trying to give birth and the midwife was there and she couldn't figure it out, and Bill identified a Cabbage Patch doll in the house. So the big thing for him was Cabbage Patch dolls. And my wife said growing up like this, is like Cabbage Patch dolls are evil. You can't have Cabbage Patch dolls.
Wow. Oh, Cabbage
Patch dolls. It's an odd. So these are things about it that are odd. Like I might say I have personal opinions about stuff, but I usually don't. Well, first I don't mention preaching, but I wouldn't say something that audacious. But there's a lot of anecdotal stories that add to the whole thing about genes, the thing about drums, the thing about Cabbage Patch dolls, and so that there's all sorts of odd idiosyncrasies. And the thing is, Gothard always pulls out a out of context passage. So they said you go in the back and you just see a torrent of index passages. And you go, oh, it's biblical, Proverbs 17:6,
Yep.
Proverbs 28:5, and you're like, wait a minute, look this up, and it's like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
But Gothard, I think the thing is, Gothard gave the people what they wanted.
Okay, so in what I was listening to today, these guys brought it up. So you talked about the origins of Gothardism, and it began at a time when the 60s young people were rebelling on college campuses. There was all this teenage angst going about, and we're at the beginnings of like the youth culture, right?
Yep.
Right. I mean, like
Yep.
the youth culture is coming into full flower, where Americans particularly focus on their children, for the first time, in history, where the children aren't just helping out on the farm, but they're like, held up, and so. These guys would see it as a response to that, and that's his heavy emphasis on authority.
Yeah.
Is when you see this rebellion against authority, Gothard is pushing back. So that's his.
That's the plug. That's
his
the
positive.
Yeah, which I don't think.
That's why he would.
I don't know that it
this.
started out to be. I think once you get so big, which I see as a lot of pastors, once they get big, that often they have these major issues, or they're in the news or whatever. But I don't know that he started out like wanting to be so authoritarian and having this. He may have just exactly what you're saying, wanted to just kind of give a solution.
Yeah, he's a man seeing his house
But
on
then
fire, and it's like, our house is on fire. We gotta deal with this.
But then you've got all these followers now, and
But the thing is, and these authors point out they document all these occasions where they confronted him about this stuff over years. And he, at every time, prevaricated, obfuscated, just basically found a way to not do that. And the weird thing is, eventually Gothard, though, the board finally kind of canned him. So they did it like a lot of groups do, where it's almost like he ceased to exist.
Like Ellen G. White.
They ghosted him.
They ghosted him. It was kind of like, who? So it's like, but because he was the singular figure that drove it, it kind of petered out. It's like too much.
Is the board, when you say the board, just of the IBLP, or is it just of Bill Gothard's like what board is it? Is there a name, or is there a...
Yes, I see. I don't even know what the organization
I need to
is
look
now.
at some of the more technical parts. I'm sure we could probably cover more. I want to make sure I don't say what I don't know.
Okay.
I know there were a lot of obviously assets that were liquidated at some points. You know.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, they had conference centers. They had huge acreages
Well,
all over the country, Michigan.
Yeah, one thing I learned is at the headquarters, when he was ascendant, when he was filling stadiums, he felt that the president of the United States would come to him. So when he built the airstrip there at the place, it was made large enough to accommodate
Air Force One?
I do want to say this,
So
though.
we can cut that out if it's not true.
Oh.
No, but these guys
No.
were
They were
were
big.
documenting this. You know, it was
And a lot of politicians that you're familiar with. I mean, Mike Huckabee, close of Gothard.
Oh, they're big on
I mean,
politics.
yes, especially parts of the South. I mean, John MacArthur in his early days was advocated some of the stuff. Later,
I like my card.
see, that explains a
I
lot.
have
but
a
it shows you a lot of
that.
a lot of people said I didn't know all this stuff. How would they? This is later. These are later developments. You would have many prominent pastors that would endorse his books. Southern Baptist pastors.
Well, and I have family that went to their conferences, and you look at them now and they would say, well, you know, I don't know that I would go to one of those now. I mean, it's just something that people are now kind of waking up to, kind of what was underneath there the whole time.
But what's amazing is there's not an equivalent contemporary person that you could point to that has the same kind of what kind of person could do these things.
Oh, I can tell you.
FLDS.
No, it was Josh Harris.
Joshua
Really?
Harris,
He-
really?
Oh yeah,
Purity guy? The kiss
I guess he did that.
About?
That would have been
You
obviously
guys
before
were fairly young, but
97 was. I
oh
was like
yeah,
12
that
years
was a church splitter.
Boy.
Josh, you know, the funny thing about Josh Harris, and I've read the story about his kind of deconstruction thing. Dude, Josh Harris, like, he tried to advocate. This whole system is based on almost a weird way, a Gothard type thing, too.
Absolutely.
His whole, remember, he wrote a second book and he was all mad because his wife had sex before she was married. And the whole book was about it, basically how he exalted himself as taking on this woman. And then later he divorces her. Like, but the big thing was like, I can't imagine meeting someone that was not pure before married, and it's like so hard, and that created resentment in their marriage. And then later he's like at some pride parade in Vancouver. So like his whole system, and I read I Kissed Dating Goodbye later.
Well, you know, you say, is there anybody like him? Well, I could go through probably half a dozen that didn't make it. So like in my time as an elder, you know, a pastor,
Yeah.
I would encounter these groups when they're filling up the Arco Arena, when they're going nationwide, when they've got worldwide missions. And so I'm dealing with them and going, there's something up here, and they would flame out. So they're reaching that level,
Yep.
but they never sustained it.
No.
So that would be Josh Harris, Teen Mania.
Yep.
What other groups? You know, I just ran into a lot of them because you would.
Yeah. And the people that go through this, I mean, you see this pattern a lot where redemption is not a part of this system. I mean, you read the content and you realize that. Like, people beat themselves up over it. Like, when I was dating, some relatives of ours, to not say names, said, well, you know, because we kissed before we married, our whole marriage, you know, has been on the rocks, kind of thing. I mean, you think you might laugh if you're watching this. Seriously, this is what people think. Like, it really does this to people, and you're haunted by it. Like, he will tell you there's no gray areas if you make any decision. Everything is either good or evil.
Right.
So some people are just like paralyzed. I can't make a decision.
Right.
If my parents don't approve of it, I'm stuck.
Wow. Well, that's been a very
There's
big
more to it.
problem.
It's heavy. It's
we could almost do like a whole episode.
I
We
would say
could
this though,
almost.
but I would say this if someone here and people here that are watching this that know what I'm talking about a little bit, the key thing you have to ask yourself is if you have really bought into, if you realize that Gothard offers a prosperity gospel and that is false, then I think you can break through it and realize like everything I have that I've done good in my marriage, whatever, is a gift of God. And God redeems broken relationships in the Bible. And Gothard does not emphasize that part of redemption in every marriage. He doesn't choose that. And that makes it a complete falsehood.
One thing that I noticed that's really detrimental in this kind of a teaching is that we want to look the part and we need to talk this way. And what happens is if something actually happens, you can't bear one another's burdens because you must portray this look of perfection. And so in essence, you're sweeping all your stuff under the rug and you're like, ooh, stuff it. Cause we can't tell it. We can't be, cause we'll be shamed. We're not going to portray ourselves like this. And so then there's this whole life that people live behind closed doors that's completely opposite of what's being portrayed. And it's toxic.
It's very much like Mormonism.
I joke about that, but I'm dead serious. FLDS, man.
Yeah, who did sin, this man or his son, that his son came home from the mission field early? I had a friend that came home from his mission early. And that was kind of the vibe that I picked up around the ward. Who did sin, this man or his son?
My gosh.
That he
it's
couldn't
what
fulfill
Jesus
his mission.
came to absolutely destroy.
Wow.
And what too, again, like I know some of this from personal experience, friends and different family members, just the marriages. I think that's one thing that's very stressed. Like if you do everything right in courtship, you will have a perfect marriage. And I'm not kidding you. People believe that.
And we're not saying that, and Brian wouldn't be saying like, yeah, no, none of the stuff in there.
No, it does matter. But
because some of the things like that he would have taught maybe could have been, and we always have to say this because it's not like we're saying everything that,
of course,
there were things in there, like principally, I get courting, because I have daughters, like I get all that.
Yep.
It's just that he took it to a whole nother level of legalism.
And it very much had to do with particular standards that were unreasonable. Just the fact that the main problem with it is just the fact that it assumes an unnatural distance between you and the potential spouse. And that's the big thing, is just that you were not allowed to have private conversations. You couldn't talk about deep stuff. There's this term defrauding, uses kind of Old Testament phrase to mean like if you talk about anything intimate. So you couldn't really be honest about a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And that's the main thing. His courtship
Shamed,
is
actually.
not, most of us would recognize like, hey, like, obviously no one's saying hookup culture is good or advocating that at all. But he that's a whole different level of courtrait. It's a very much
It's shame-based. I mean, I feel like it's very shame-driven.
And it's one that like, it's just not, they called it unbiblical, unreasonable, unviable, and unfair.
Oh.
Anyone who's been a part of it, a listener, knows exactly how it's unfair. Because oftentimes it means that there's a long period where a guy is, ironically, it's kind of like Jacob and Laban. Like, when you finally have the $500,000 in cash to pay the house, then you can marry my daughter when you're 40.
The bride price.
The bride price.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of things, if you take it like hook, line, sinker, you're like, man, I can't work enough hours to do this.
Yeah. And I'm certain that if anyone's gone through this or is currently disentangling, they call it, or Deacon, that was a Ginger Duggar, I think, coined this, or at least a Childers show, I think. But if you're going through that, I'm sure, if you're local to our area, you can reach out to Ryan or Bo. Or your local pastors, honestly, your pastors, if you have questions.
And that you work, that we, like I said, Janae and I have talked about this, that if you've been hurt by it, that you're able to forgive. Because that's the one thing I've noticed, a lot of people in it have implicitly been taught you don't forgive. And that no one in authority ever makes a mistake.
Implicitly.
Right. Implicitly.
Ooh. Right.
So there's so part of that is being able to forgive family members, forgive those that did you. And a lot of people are like, I hate.
And not do the pendulum swing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not the Christian, and that's what you find out. The Christian faith, this isn't gospel. This is that's the part the trick is. You got fooled into that.
No.
Well, we want to be fooled. We want someone to have the answer, and I can remember being a young husband, father, and you need some, you're looking for some wisdom and answers. And people would, you'd have people say, well, it's right there in the scriptures. But, some of it's hard to, sift through and figure out.
Yeah.
So there is a sense in which you welcome a lot of input.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of it boils down to just Christianity 101.
Yeah, Christianity 101.
So if you've got a guy that's got problems with adoption or forgiveness, it's kind of like, well, or you have a man leading this who is unapproachable.
Yeah.
That's Christianity 101.
Yeah. Or if you even say things like the standards for a husband are standards that really are secular. I mean, it doesn't actually tell you the financial threshold that you need to meet. I mean, I think it's kind of based on reason.
That's why, when I used to do marriage counseling, premarital counseling, I would tell couples right away, I'm not going to tell you what to do. We're going to look at the scriptures. And I meant that like, there is no, you're going to have to get to know the couple. So like
schoolings, things like that.
Yeah. I counseled people who were blue collar. I counseled people who were professional.
Yep.
I counseled people who were entrepreneurial.
Yep.
Basically I would tell them, I would say, my job is to help you to learn how to dialogue. Yeah. So I'm going to start fights.
Cool.
Wow.
And I don't mean that in a negative way, but I'm going to bring up difficult things that you're going to encounter.
That's good wisdom.
And since I don't know you or do I that well, or nor do I know your future, I'm going to have to depend on the Holy Spirit to bring out things between you that I don't even know exist. Mm-hmm. And on more than one occasion, that proved to be very fruitful, like where something came up. But if you've got a prescriptive, Talmudic, sort of approach, you're just going to tell people, you're going to say, you're going to have a real problem submitting to him. I just know it. And maybe she wouldn't.
Yeah, I've heard of people who've gone to these like churches. I don't know what they call themselves now that promote this stuff. A lot of it's a legalism church. I don't know, coin it how you will, but they'll tell the woman often. I've heard this twice now, that they'll tell the woman, well, it's basically your fault that your husband is having this issue. And
in Gothard's teaching, that is a huge theme too, because the umbrella, the if you're married, the wife is below the husband, so it's depending on where you're at in the strata.
Oh my gosh.
More guilt is falling.
Right.
Well, I think that pretty much summarizes as much as we can say. We want to hear your feedback. So add some comments.
And for me, like I said, I encountered it in 1975 and just wasn't interested. So I had to go out and refresh or kind of figure out, because I didn't watch Shiny Happy People. Sorry.
Right. Yeah, it shouldn't be your main.
I mean, I know, I kind of understood.
Yeah.
I could pick up what was going on with it, And so all that to say is there's lots of good material out there. And on Adventism, the same thing.
Yeah.
Responsible, good material.
Thanks for joining.
Join us. Click and subscribe, and we look forward to hearing from you.
And hit that like button.
Oh my God.
Pound
hit that like button.
Oh.
Goodbye.